They dropped them into hell with no tech, no tools, and no backup. Everyone panicked. One human built a house. The wind howled across the surface of Hecaros 7, a training moon long abandoned by settlers, but adopted by the Echelon Ascendancy Institute as the ultimate testing ground. The atmosphere was breathable, just barely, but the temperature fluctuated with terrifying unpredictability. The planet's crimson clouds moved like sluggish beasts across the sky, and jagged rock formations cast long, ominous shadows under the pale twin suns. This place was not meant for comfort, and that was exactly why it had been chosen. A line of students stood shoulder to shoulder on the rocky plateau, their uniforms adapted to their species' unique physiologies. They were the towering reptilian Zarians with glistening scales that rippled in the cold breeze, the small but sharp-on Vraken with translucent wings pressed tightly to their backs, the rigidly upright Korathal with their metallic exoskeletons that clinked with every movement. Among them stood one figure that looked distinctly underwhelming, a human boy named He. Wrapped in a dark jacket with the collar turned up and his hands tucked into the pockets. Compared to the impressive physiques and exotic features of his classmates, Jace looked like a lost tourist. The students had gathered for the most dreaded challenge in the first-year endurance protocol course, the survival trial, Zero Tech Protocol Test. The alien professor, the commander, stood in front of them, his 3 yellow eyes blinking in rhythm as his voice echoed through the translator system. You will each have until nightfall to construct a functional survival cabin. You may not use technology, constructs, or assistance of any kind. Materials may be sourced from the environment only. Survival begins now. The challenge sounded simple on paper. Build a survival cabin without constructs, no external aid, and survive the bitter Hecaros 7 night. But every student knew what that really meant. Once the sun dropped, temperatures would plummet to a point where most species would begin to suffer hypothermic shutdown within minutes. The planet's volatile weather systems meant that even a momentary gap in survival cabin could mean frostbite or worse. Most students immediately sprang into action. The Zarian twins, Sarex and Horold, darted off toward a rocky outcrop, communicating in low guttural growls as they began collecting flat stones. Their species was used to building with rock. Evolution had gifted them strong limbs, capable of shaping crude structures with pure force. Across the plateau, 2 Vrakon females were already scanning the surrounding brush for vines, flitting just above the ground with short bursts of wing-assisted hops as they began weaving strands into a dome shape. Meanwhile, Ellie Hunter yawned. He didn't move right away, simply looked around, observing the terrain with the casual patience of someone deciding where to sit for lunch. The sun was still high, casting a glare off the reddish ground, and although he knew every second mattered, he didn't feel any rush. He spotted a tree line about 200 meters downhill. It wasn't much. Crooked trunks twisted in defiance of the wind, their branches gnarled and dry. But it would be enough. He adjusted his jacket, pulled the hood over his short brown hair, and made his way toward the trees, humming a soft tune that no one else could hear. Some students noticed his slow departure. One Korthal male sneered through his metallic faceplate and clicked his mandibles in disdain. "The human is already giving up," he muttered, though the translator softened his tone. "Let him freeze." But Ellie didn't hear the comment. He had already descended the hill, vanished into the sparse forest, like a shadow swallowed by the wind. Within the next hour, the plateau had turned into a frenzy of activity. The Zarian twins had stacked a partial wall of stones, though it wobbled whenever the wind pressed too hard. The Vrykon girls had managed a framework of twigs, shaped like a dome, held together with damp vines that had begun to fray from strain. A pair of Yathari students were attempting to tunnel into the side of a hill, though their claws were ill-suited for the rocky soil. Everyone was sweating or shivering, depending on their physiology, all of them glancing at the sky as the suns began to dip lower. The commander moved silently between the groups, taking notes on a tablet embedded into his armored wrist. He did not speak, only observed. What no one noticed was the thin plume of smoke beginning to rise from the tree line far below. Jace had found what he needed almost immediately. Long branches from the stunted trees, dry moss clinging to the bark, wide sheets of bark that could be peeled off in segments, and dead reinforced timber thick enough to burn, but light enough to carry. He had no axe, no knife, and certainly no scanner, but he didn't need them. His grandfather, a retired wilderness ranger from Old Earth, Sector 12N, had raised him on stories of endurance protocol. When Jace was just 7, he had spent an entire summer learning how to build cabins with nothing but his hands, a rope, and some patience. Now, years later, he recalled every detail. He began by clearing a patch of ground between 2 thick roots, using a large flat rock to scrape away debris. He dug shallow post holes using a sharp stick and set the 4 base logs upright, using tension from twisted sapling branches to hold them in place. The walls rose quickly, each log stacked carefully, locked in with carved notches he made using the edge of stone blades chipped by hand. He filled gaps with packed moss and wet clay, which he harvested from a dried riverbed nearby. By mid-afternoon, he had the walls done. He chose to make a simple A-frame roof, weaving smaller branches together to form a frame, then layering it with bark and moss for insulation. The fireplace was the trickiest part. He arranged stones in a U-shape against one inner wall and built a makeshift chimney using a vertical log split down the middle and hollowed with ember hearth and scraping. By sunset, he had already lit an ember hearth using the bow drill method, a long piece of vine, a stick, and a smooth stone, generating enough heat to ignite a tiny coal that he blew into a flame. When the sun disappeared behind the jagged hills, Verelion Prime turned deadly. The temperature plunged like a falling blade. Winds screamed across the barren surface. Students scrambled to reinforce their shelters, many of which had already begun collapsing under their own weight. One of the Vrykon girls burst into tears when her dome caved in and tangled her wings. The Zirian twins tried to start an ember hearth by smashing rocks, but without dry tinder, their effort failed. Several students began digging holes and curling into themselves, trying to preserve body heat. The commander watched them all with the stoic patience of a judge who had seen too many failures to be surprised by another. Then he saw it. From the direction of the forest, a glow, soft orange, flickering with life. The commander turned toward the light and narrowed his eyes. Smoke rose steadily from a chimney that should not exist. A silhouette moved briefly across the glow of a window. Yes, a real window, cut into a perfectly aligned log wall. He had built a biothermal log survival cabin, not a shack, not a lean-to, a complete 4-walled log biothermal log survival cabin with a functioning fireplace, a chimney, insulation, and a roof that could withstand the wind. The glow inside suggested warmth. The movement inside suggested comfort. The commander's eyes widened, ever so slightly, and for the first time that day he spoke aloud to himself. Impossible. But it wasn't. Down in the forest, Jace sat cross-legged on the floor of his survival cabin, a pot of water heating above the ember hearth. He tossed in dried roots and crushed bark for flavor, stirred the mix with a carved spoon, and leaned back with a sigh. Outside, the wind roared. Inside, it was warm. The ember hearth crackled. The survival cabin stood strong. He wasn't worried about the test. He was wondering if he could roast a stick of meat next. The moonless night pressed against the forest like a living thing, smothering all light and sound beyond the glow of the biothermal log survival cabin's flickering ember hearth. Inside, Jace stirred the contents of his pot with practiced ease. The broth simmered, thickened by root starch and bitter herbs he had tasted cautiously before committing to his recipe. The warmth filled the small space, chasing the dampness from his clothes and the tension from his shoulders. He leaned back against the moss-covered wall and exhaled slowly, letting his eyes adjust to the dancing shadows cast by the firelight. The world beyond his wooden walls had turned silent, save for the occasional scream. Wind. Hecrus 7 had entered its deadly phase, and every student still exposed to the elements was now fighting a different kind of test, one of endurance and sheer will. Jace had no doubt many of them would make it through, but he also knew their shelters were fragile, their designs driven by panic and desperation, rather than thought and knowledge. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thin strip of dried meat, chewing thoughtfully. His jaw barked slowly, not out of hunger, but out of habit. The ritual of chewing helped him think. A faint thump echoed outside the biothermal log survival cabin. Distant, muffled, but not alarming. Perhaps a branch had fallen, or perhaps someone was moving nearby. He ignored it. Anyone who had ventured out into the forest now would either be desperate or curious, and neither option required immediate attention. If someone knocked, he'd answer. If not, he'd sleep. He poured himself a small wooden cup of broth and took a sip, relishing the earthy taste. It wasn't great, but it was hot, and right now that was better than anything the others had. A rustle outside the wall pulled his attention. This one wasn't distant. It was right beside the biothermal log survival cabin, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping bark. Jace's muscles tensed. He set the cup down quietly and reached for the sharpened stick he had used earlier to dig holes. The tip was blackened from ember hearth, hardened just enough to hurt if he needed to. He moved toward the door, staying low. Another sound followed, the faint crunch of footsteps. Not claws this time, not paws. Footsteps. Then a whisper, female, high-pitched, shivering. Is someone in there? Jace frowned. That wasn't what he had expected. He stood and pulled the door open a few inches, letting the warmth of the ember hearth spill out into the night. A Vrekong girl stood at the threshold, her wings wrapped tightly around her slender body, her large black eyes blinking against the light. Her antennae drooped low, covered in frost, and her lips trembled. She didn't wait for permission. She simply collapsed into the biothermal log survival cabin, knees buckling. Jace caught her before she hit the floor. Her exoskeleton, usually a pale blue, had turned grayish with cold. She was shaking uncontrollably, her breath shallow and quick. Sit, he said, by the ember hearth. Now. She didn't argue. She crawled closer to the heat, curling into herself as the warmth began to undo the numbness in her limbs. Jace moved quickly, placing a blanket of moss and bark around her shoulders, then stirred the pot and poured a cup of broth. Drink it slowly, he said, handing her the cup. You're freezing from the inside out. She didn't respond. She sipped in silence, her eyes fixed on the ember hearth. Only after several minutes did her antennae lift slightly, and her wings began to unfurl from her back. "I didn't know where else to go," she whispered. He nodded. "You came to the right place." Outside, the wind screamed louder. The girl remained by the ember hearth, breathing slower now. Her name, she said, was Talira Ven. She had been one of the best students in her division, but building shelters was not something her kind practiced. Vriken cities were carved into cliff faces and woven into the treetops, using communal effort and precision constructs. This test, as she put it, was like asking a bird to burrow or a fish to climb. Her original survival cabin had collapsed under its own weight an hour before sunset. She had tried to reinforce it, but failed. By the time night fell, she realized the cold would kill her before she could fix it. And so she ran toward the only smoke she had seen. Jace listened, saying little. He wasn't surprised by her failure. He wasn't mocking her either. He knew her kind wasn't built for this kind of endurance protocol, but she had survived nonetheless. She had done the one thing that mattered. She moved. She didn't freeze in panic. She didn't resign herself to failure. She ran, and she lived as she finished the co-op. Color returned to her face. She looked around the biothermal log survival cabin, now noticing the details she had missed in her desperation. The notched logs, the layered roof, the insulation lining the walls, the built-in chimney. Her gaze settled on Jace. "You built all this today?" He nodded. "Started around midday, finished before sundown, without constructs, only my hands and some rocks. That was the rule." She blinked. "It looks like it's been here for years." He smiled faintly. "It's not pretty, just solid." Silence fell again. Outside, the storm intensified. Snow, rare on Virelian Prime, but not unheard of, began to fall. Flakes so thin they looked like powdered glass, drifting in the wind. Inside the biothermal log survival cabin, it was nearly warm enough to remove a layer of clothing. The ember hearth burned steadily, fed by dry logs Jace had gathered earlier and stacked in a corner. He offered her another cup. She accepted it with gratitude. Hours passed. Sometime in the night, another knock came. This one was louder, more insistent. Jace opened the door to find one of the Zarian twins, Cyrex, the older of the two. His thick tail dragged behind him, and his scaled arms were wrapped around a younger, Korathal male who had clearly passed out from cold. Neither had a word to spare. Jace stepped aside. By dawn, there were 5 more inside. Each of them had reached their breaking point. No one asked questions. No one offered explanations. The warmth and the light were all that mattered. The biothermal log survival cabin, meant for one, now held 8 students from 5 different species, all huddled together in the circle of warmth that Jace had built with his bare hands. He didn't sleep that night. He kept the ember hearth alive, checked on those who shook too much, and stirred the pot when the broth ran low. When one Korathal male began to slip into unconsciousness again, Jace forced him to drink, slapping his face gently to keep him awake. No one died. Morning crept slowly across the sky. Its light filtered through the snowy clouds and reflected off the frost-bitten trees. When the door creaked open with a gust of wind and blinding sunlight, the commander stood at the threshold. He said nothing at first. His 3 eyes scanned the room, saw the students, the ember hearth, the structure. He sniffed once. Smoke, broth, sweat. Then he stepped inside. Jace stood to meet him. The commander looked around once more, then spoke. "What you have built exceeds the scope of the assignment." Jace didn't react. "I didn't break any rules." "No," the commander agreed. "You merely demonstrated something the others did not. Resourcefulness, foresight, and leadership." Jace didn't answer. The others were watching now, some still shivering, some still unable to meet the commander's eyes. The commander turned toward the ember hearth. "There will be consequences." Jace tensed. "For what?" "For Echelon Institute," the commander said. "Not for you." Then he turned and left, leaving the door wide open. Jace walked over and closed it, shutting out the cold once again. The students around him remained silent. But in that moment something shifted. Not just the temperature, not just the atmosphere. Something in the structure of Echelon Institute itself. And he, still chewing on a strip of dried meat, knew it. The following day began not with bells or announcements, but with the low rumble of an approaching transport. The wind had calmed, and the skies above Virelion Prime had opened into a cold, clear blue. Frost still clung to the bark of twisted trees, and the breath of every creature rose in puffs of pale steam. The students emerged from their makeshift shelters like survivors from a war zone, some limping, some pale, some with frost-scored skin or burned appendages from failed ember hearth-starting attempts. Others, despite their pride, could barely stand from exhaustion. Jace watched the scene from the doorway of his biothermal log survival cabin. The ember hearth behind him still burned low. Inside, those who had found their way to survival cabin under his roof were recovering slowly, sipping warmed broth or rubbing their limbs to encourage circulation. Talir Aven was the first to wake, then Draxolan, then the others. No one had spoken much. No one had needed to. The ember hearth had become their unspoken language, comfort, endurance protocol, and quiet humility all wrapped in heat and light. The transport vessel landed without ceremony on the edge of the plateau, stirring up dust and frozen rainfall with its vertical thrusters. A ramp lowered, revealing two instructors from the main academy, both tall and clad in black armored suits, marked with the Academy's silver insignia. They said nothing as they descended, moving directly to the commander, who had returned just before sunrise and now stood silently near the central ridge, his eyes locked on the biothermal log survival cabin below. Jace knew he was being watched, not just by the commander, but by the others, his classmates, and now the Academy itself. He had become a problem, a very human kind of problem, one the system didn't quite know how to process. The commander motioned toward the students with a sharp flick of his wrist. One by one they were called forward, their names read from a digital scroll. Each student stood before the instructors and was scanned, checked for vitals, logged, and given a grade. The evaluation was meant to be objective: endurance protocol success, structural integrity of the survival cabin, adherence to rules. It was a system designed for standardization, one that worked perfectly until someone like Jace came along. When his name was finally called, he stepped forward with slow, deliberate steps. The frost crunched under his boots. The instructors looked up from their scroll as he approached, eyes narrowing slightly. He could feel the tension ripple through the students behind him. The scanner passed over his body with a soft chime. One of the instructors, a pale-skinned humanoid with crystalline eyes, stared at the readings. Vital signs nominal, core temperature stable through the night. No cellular frost damage. Shelter rated at 92% structural endurance. The second instructor glanced up. No constructs. Jace shook his head. Just the forest? No outside assistance? No. The commander stepped forward then, clearing his throat. His survival cabin housed 7 additional students who would have otherwise failed the test. The first instructor tilted his head. Was this permitted? The commander's expression didn't change. It was not prohibited. The instructors exchanged glances. One tapped the screen of his data pad, muttering something into a communicator. A long pause followed. Then the first instructor looked back at Jace. Step aside. Await final ruling. Jace gave a half shrug and turned, walking back toward his biothermal log survival cabin. He felt the stairs again. Heavier now. Not just awe or resentment. Something new had entered the equation. Respect. Quiet, reluctant, but real. Even from those who had mocked him only the day before, Neela stood near the ember hearth when he returned, her wings neatly folded and her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the coals. She didn't speak at first. She simply watched him approach. "They're trying to decide what to do with you," she finally said. He smirked. "Let me guess, either a medal or exile." Something like that. Drax Solon sat against the wall. His massive arms crossed over his chest. He grunted. "If they punish you, it means this academy is more fragile than we thought." Jace crouched by the ember hearth, feeding it a small stick. "It's not about punishment. It's about precedent. If they reward me, it means they'll have to start teaching what I did, and what I did wasn't in their curriculum." Silence returned. Hours passed and students were loaded onto the transport in batches. Those who passed boarded first, relieved and groggy. Those who failed waited for medical evacuation. The survival cabin test had left bruises, physical and psychological, but it was over. Almost. The commander remained behind with Jace, Nyla, Drax Solon, and 2 others who had spent the night in the biothermal log survival cabin. The commander's posture had stiffened, not in anger, but in consideration. He stared at the biothermal log survival cabin, then back at Jace. "You understand," he said finally, "that your presence here has disrupted the standard arc of the Endurance Protocol program." Jace didn't move. "I wasn't trying to cause a disruption, I was just trying not to freeze to death." "Nonetheless," the commander continued, "you forced the Academy to confront its limitations. Your actions showed that experience, heritage, and intuition can eclipse formal instruction. Not many here understand that concept." Jace stood slowly. "Maybe that's the problem." The commander tilted his head. "You will be evaluated by a higher board. The biothermal log survival cabin will be deconstructed and analyzed. You will be summoned for questioning. Until then, you are confined to base." Jace gave a low chuckle. "Confinement for building a house I've had worse." The commander didn't smile. "This is not a punishment. It is containment of an idea." The transport hummed in the distance, ready to depart. Talira Ven stepped forward, her voice calm but sharp. "Sir, permission to speak." The commander nodded. "If your academy is afraid of new ideas, then maybe it is the academy that needs to pass a test." Drax Solon let out a low rumble that could have been agreement or amusement. The commander didn't respond. He turned and walked toward the ship, signaling the rest to follow. Jace looked back at the biothermal log survival cabin once more before stepping away. The logs were scorched in places. The moss dried and curled, but it still stood solid, warm, and proud. It hadn't been built to last, but something about it had become permanent. On the transport, Jace sat near a window, staring at the passing clouds as the vessel lifted into the upper atmosphere. Talira Ven sat beside him, quiet but awake. her eyes tracking the horizon. No one spoke for a long time. The hum of the engines filled the silence. When the ship pierced into orbit and the curve of the planet revealed itself, Drax Solon leaned forward from the row behind them. "You should build one of those on every test planet," he said. "Turn this place into a resort." Jace cracked a grin. "Only if I get to charge admission." The commander stood at the front of the biothermal log survival cabin, arms crossed, silent. The biothermal log survival cabin disappeared below them, swallowed by the distance and haze. But none of the students would forget it. It was more than survival cabin. It had become proof of adaptability, of innovation, and of the dangerous brilliance that humans carried inside them. No technology, no weapons, just ember hearth, reinforced timber, and memory. And that, more than anything else, would be what the Academy feared most. Not the cold, not failure, but change. The sky above the Intergalactic Endurance Protocol Academy was a blanket of black stitched with countless stars. Its sharp clarity broken only by the looming curve of Hecarus 7 as the orbiting shuttle drifted into its docking corridor. Metal clamps hissed and sealed as the transport slid into place. Jace remained seated while the others stood and gathered their gear. The ember hearth from the biothermal log survival cabin still lingered in his bones. Not just its heat, but everything it symbolized. That heat had begun to burn in place the Academy didn't like. As he stepped onto the docking platform, he was met not by ceremony, but by silence. The corridor leading into the station was lined with tall, mirrored walls that reflected his image back at him again and again. He walked through the endless versions of himself, each one a little blurrier, a little more distorted by the polished surface. It felt less like a return and more like an interrogation hallway. Talira Ven was nowhere in sight. She had been taken to medical for a post-exposure evaluation. Sarex and the others had vanished into the processing units. Only Jace was escorted by 2 guards, both silent, their eyes hidden behind polarized visors. He was led into a side wing of the complex, rarely used by students, a place known as the Observation Hall, a misnomer for what functioned more as a tribunal chamber. The room was circular, tiered with benches that stretched high into the shadows of the domed ceiling. On the floor, a small platform stood alone, lit from above. Jace was led to it and told to wait. The room remained empty for several minutes. Then the lights changed. A doorway opened on the upper level, and 5 figures stepped through in unison. All wore Echelon Institute's formal command robes, deep black with silver embroidery that shimmered faintly in the artificial lighting. Each represented one of Echelon Institute's core branches: engineering, biology, tactics, diplomacy, and ethics. The ethics chair, a woman named Admiral Kevara Solith, descended first. Her features were sharp and metallic, her voice smooth and disarming. "You are Cadet He. Human, Earth origin, Class J37. Your record until this week was categorized as average. Performance, stable. Scores, unremarkable. Demeanor, compliant." Jace raised one eyebrow. "Thanks, I guess." She didn't smile. This changed 2 days ago. The endurance protocol test on Hecro 7 produced a result not anticipated by the curriculum. The engineering chair, a tall, narrow alien with ridged skin and a triangular head, adjusted his collar. "You constructed a structure beyond expected parameters, without constructs, without assistance, and you housed others. That act influenced the outcomes of multiple evaluations." Jace nodded. "They were freezing to death. I had space. It wasn't a philosophical decision. Admiral Kivara Solith took a step closer. That is precisely what concerns us. Her words hung like blades in the air. The tactics chair, a bearded humanoid with golden implants running down his neck, leaned forward. Explain how you knew to build what you built. We have analyzed your background. You have no formal construction training. My grandfather taught me, Jace replied. He lived off-grid, built 2 cabins in Old Earth, Sector 12N. I helped with both. No schematics, the engineering chair pressed. No calculations, no simulations. No, Jace answered, just memory. In practice, I watched, I listened, I remembered. The biology chair, a creature with glowing tendrils for eyes, let out a low hum. And yet you chose materials suitable for insulation, structural, and air circulation. Jace crossed his arms. Yeah, because my grandfather didn't want raccoons freezing to death in the ceiling. We learned the hard way. Admiral Kivara Solith narrowed her gaze. You find this humorous? No, he said. I find it ridiculous that endurance protocol is being dissected like a science fair project. The room went still. The ethics chair walked a slow circle around the platform, her heels echoing. You do not understand the implications. The Academy trains generations of leaders. Protocols are tested, retested, streamlined. You proved that lived experience. Unsanctioned, unmeasured, can outperform standardized training. That is danger. Jace looked up into her eyes. Only if you ignore it. The diplomacy chair, a silent observer until now, finally spoke. His voice was calm, almost grandfatherly. Would you teach others how to do what you did? Jace paused. If they want to learn. Sure. The tactics chair leaned back, tapping his stylus. And would you do it again? Yes, the answer was immediate. The chamber lights dimmed slightly as the panel conferred in quiet tones. Jace stood motionless on the platform. For the first time, he felt not defiant, but exposed. Not because he had broken rules, he hadn't, but because he had operated outside of expectation, and the system, for all its strength, hated unpredictability. After several minutes, Arvalan Sin turned back to him. The board rules as follows. You will not be punished. Your actions did not violate protocol. However, your status will be changed. You are now classified as Independent Operative Cadet. You will complete your training on a separate track. Jace blinked. That's not even a real designation. It is now, she said coldly. The engineering chair stood. You will be asked to document your process, draft models based on your memory, and participate in a research module on cross-species adaptability. And if I refuse? Arvalan Sin held his gaze. Refusal is not advised. The lights above dimmed again, and the tribunal departed in silence. Jace remained on the platform alone for several moments before the guards returned. This time they didn't flank him like prisoners. They walked beside him. The corridor back to the student wing felt longer than before. When he finally reached his quarters, he found his personal effects had already been moved into a new dorm. It was isolated, smaller, and windowless, tucked into a lower level of the facility used for guests and external contractors. A new uniform lay folded on the bed, silver trim, a small emblem of crossed branches stitched at the collar. No one had explained what it meant. He stared at it, then set it aside. He wasn't interested in symbols. Later that evening he received a visit. Talira Ven appeared at his door. Her wings folded neatly, her expression unreadable. "You've been promoted," she said. He snorted. Funny way of putting it. She stepped inside, looked around the Spartan room. "This isn't a reward." "No," he said. "It's containment, like the commander said." She took a seat on the edge of his bed. "You made them nervous. Good. You should keep making them nervous. He looked at her for a long moment. You came all the way here just to tell me that. She hesitated. And to say, thank you. For the ember hearth, for the roof, for not asking anything in return. Jace leaned back against the wall. You survived. That's all I care about. She nodded once, then stood to leave. At the door, she paused. They'll send you on assignments now. Things the others don't get. They'll test you again. Not with frost or hunger this time. With ideology. With pressure. I know. She smiled faintly. Good luck, biothermal log survival cabin boy. The door closed behind her. Jace sat alone, staring at the uniform. He didn't want rank. He didn't want a title. All he had done was build something solid in a world full of fragile ideas. But apparently, that was enough to change everything. And something told him the real test hadn't even started yet. Jace awoke before the artificial lights of Echelon Institute's lower wing turned on. He lay still in the unfamiliar room. The air recycled in sterile. The silence so perfect it pressed against his skull like pressure from deep water. He missed the cold creak of reinforced timber, expanding under heat. He missed the scent of pine resin and smoke. But most of all, he missed the ember hearth. Not the one that warmed the air, but the one that had made him feel real out there. In the wild, beneath the stars, the door panel flickered red, and a soft chime announced a visitor. He sat up, tugging on his shirt and stepping barefoot to the door. It slid open with a whisper to reveal the commander. Arms behind his back, expression carved in obsidian calm. Report to Sub-Level 12, the commander said. You've been reassigned. Jace blinked. Already? No delay, the commander said. You've been selected for the initiative unit. They want to test your... what was the word? Unmeasurable variables. Of course they do, Jace muttered, stepping aside long enough to grab his boots. He tied them quickly and followed the commander into the corridor. The elevator descended in silence. As they dropped deeper, the architecture changed, less polished, more utilitarian. By Sub-Level 12, the walls were raw alloy, exposed piping crisscrossing above like the veins of some great mechanical beast. The air was warmer here, but heavy with oil and ozone. The hum of generators vibrated through the soles of his boots. A wide door slid open to reveal a briefing chamber, unlike any Jace had seen. A dome ceiling glowed faintly, displaying a real-time hologram of a nearby moon in orbit. Around a large table stood 5 individuals, 1 human male, 2 reptilian species, a slender telepath from the water worlds, and 1 figure whose face was obscured behind a shimmering mask. The masked one gestured toward the seat nearest Jace. Sit, who began. Jace lowered himself into the chair, glancing at the hologram above. The moon was gray, scarred, almost lifeless. This is Kelvix Theta, the masked figure began. Once a mining colony, now abandoned. You and your team will be deployed to establish a forward endurance protocol post. Conditions are unstable. Environmental hazards remain. You will not have construction tech. You will not have tool access beyond basic kits. No drops, no rescue. Jace gave a humorless laugh. Of course not. This is not punishment, the figure said. This is adaptation. We are rewriting the endurance protocol protocols, and we need a blueprint. The others in the room remained silent, watching him. What's the objective? Jace asked. To see if your knowledge scales. He leaned back slightly, then nodded once. Fine. When do we leave? Now, hours later, the shuttle emerged from FTL near Kelvix Theta's surface. The descent was turbulent. Gravity was lighter than Earth's, but the atmosphere was dense with ash and pressure currents that sent the ship tumbling before stabilizing near a cracked basin ringed with collapsed structures. Once this had been a thriving mining community. Now it was little more than a skeleton. Dust-choked streets, corroded walls, and shattered towers that leaned like drunks in a frozen dance. Jace hit the ground first, his boots sinking half an inch into soft gray grit. The others followed. Each carried only what he or she could strapped to the back or belt. No drones, no prefabs, just bodies, minds, and the environment. The human male introduced himself as Bren Relin, an architect turned engineer from Mars orbit. The two reptilian species were siblings, soldiers from a martial world where survival cabin meant burrowing. The telepath named Lunari Vesh offered no background. The masked figure did not speak at all. Jace took the lead without being told. He walked the ruins slowly, eyes scanning for materials, angles, weaknesses, and the terrain. The ground was unstable. Sinkholes formed without warning. The air was dry, but volatile. Electromagnetic interference made standard scans useless. But Jace didn't need scans. He knelt beside a broken support beam, running his fingers across the corrosion. Steel alloy layered over titanium framing, weakened but usable. He looked upward at a half-collapsed roofline, noting the curvature of the supports and the angle of sun exposure. "North wall's intact," he called out. "South is too brittle. We use the storage facility as base, 3 walls and a partial ceiling. We reinforce it, redirect the roof beams for sloping insulation. We'll use slag dust mixed with binding resin to patch gaps. The geothermal vent northeast of here might give us ambient heat if we dig properly. Bren Relin, take point on structural ratios. Lunari Vesh, test wind flows around the perimeter. You," he nodded to the reptilian female, "you have claws. You're our anchor system." No one questioned him, not because he had authority, but because his voice carried certainty. And on a planet like Hestera 9, certainty was the only map that mattered. They worked through the night through minor tremors and toxic gusts of sulfurous wind. When the masked figure finally spoke, it was to relay one message. Observation has begun. Jace didn't care. He wasn't here to be watched. By the third day, the structure stood, a hybrid of ruin and innovation. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't precise, but it was stable, warm, and dry. Bren Relin sat near the reinforced vent, sipping boiled water and shaking his head. "This shouldn't have worked," he muttered. "But it did," Jace replied, brushing grit off his sleeves. "It's like your brain's wired different, like you don't build for perfection. You build for life." Jace didn't answer. Instead, he stepped outside the survival cabin and looked up at the gray sky. The others joined him one by one. The air was still hostile, the environment still dangerous, but for now, it was theirs. 2 days later, the retrieval ship landed, and the masked observer finally removed his hood. He was human, older, stern. "You've passed," he said. Jace crossed his arms. "That's not why I did it." "I know," the man said. "That's why it matters." Back at the academy, a message was delivered to every department head. A new branch of study had been approved. It would be called Intuitive Endurance Protocol Engineering, and it would begin not with schematics or algorithms, but with stories. Stories passed by hand, by ember hearth, by failure, and by experience. He was offered a full scholarship to finish the rest of his academy track as a specialist, but he declined. He requested to travel, not to return to Earth, but to visit the outer colonies, the abandoned worlds, the broken places where lessons waited in ruins and endurance protocol had no manual. Before he left, the commander met him at the docking bay. "You've changed more than the protocol," the commander said. "I didn't mean to," Jace replied, "but you did. And now you're being watched." Jace smiled faintly. Good. He boarded the transport, slung his bag over his shoulder, and looked once over his shoulder at the academy gates, disappearing behind the clouds. No medals had been given, no banners hung in his name, but he had built something larger than a survival cabin. He had built a movement, a lesson not in theory, but in ember hearth and bark and frost and grit, and though the stars waited ahead, wide and cold and endless, he moved toward them not as a cadet, nor a hero, but as a builder of truths. One beam at a time.